As a historian, talk to us a little bit about the real history of America's founding.
Yeah, well, I won't deny that all of the stuff of these last 45 years that basically is generally associated with the left harangue of American history, that somehow we're the promoters of simply the story of exploitation, oppression, imperialism. There is a certain truth in that. I'll just say that my own generation of historians who came in the 60s and 70s, and you had on my dear friend some weeks or maybe months ago, Eric Foner. I'm pretty sure when we came into history, it was with the idea that we were going to redeem the real story of America, and we were going to change the narrative so that, for example, that whereas conservatives always hyped the likes of Washington and Adams and so on, that we were going to bring out the story of especially my hero, Thomas Paine, but also of the way in which artisans and farmers and laborers and even slaves themselves pursued the question of freedom and equality in diverse ways, and yet together ended up literally sort of launching a revolution that to this day, I think resonates. And this is where I think we on the left sometimes lose touch with what would really empower us and working people. The original promise that was part of the revolution, stated so clearly in Thomas Paine's Common Sense, we have it in our power to begin the world over again, and then articulated, and undeniably, too many of them were slaveholders, but the promise itself transcended the pens that wrote it. All the truths that are self-evident. All men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that became a promise that we tend to berate because of the fact that every time we succeed in creating some really democratic progress, we find ourselves immediately sort of pushed up against the wall and thrown back, as we have these last 45 years in the wake of the struggles of the 60s. But it really is the case that we have to lay hold of that story, and we have to promote it as opposed to simply berate the story of America, because in fact most Americans still feel that original promise. It's my friend Bill Moyers said to me one time, he said, it's a promise that we're the heirs of, whether we're native born or newly arrived. And it's amazing the degree to which immigrants themselves, for all of the struggles and sufferings that so many times they endure, they really do pick up on that quickly. So if we go from the beginning, when the very first folks who laid hold of the promise of the Declaration actually were Black Americans in New England, who were then demanding their freedom based on that promise, and we think of it today as a promise that sort of beats within us, but is often neglected because conservatives do not want to remind Americans of that promise. Liberals and even all too many progressives run from the story of America because they've already sort of bought into the argument that it's just one long story of tragedy and irony. And there's no doubt about the exploitation of oppression. But I do think that it's crucial for us to literally grab hold of this and speak to Americans and let them know why they feel as they do. I mean, Americans are unhappy, dissatisfied. Hell, in 2016, the majority of Americans told pollsters they wanted radical action. So if that's the case, then let's encourage Americans to understand why they feel that way, that to be an American is essentially to be a radical. And of course, the powers that be do not want us to understand that, do not want us to recognize that. They probably get a kick out of the fact that hustle culture, becomes so current and so, if you like, influential among young people. I mean, it's tragic in that sense too. So yeah, we've got to take hold of that promise. I'll just put it this way. I know I'm talking longer than I should, trying to overcome the stress of the hustle culture, I think.
Not at all.
I think this is the case. I mean, this is to me the really sorry part of that state of affairs we're in, and the tragedy of Bernie not becoming president, perhaps, is that whenever Americans have confronted really mortal crises in regards to the survival of the nation, or more importantly, the survival of the promise, historically, they found their way somehow to transcend their own faults and failings and to act in radical ways. That's how the United States was, for all of the faults and failings and the tragedy, it was the makings of a democratic republic. In the Civil War, the fact was that what enables the Civil War to turn out to be a Union victory is, first of all, that slaves in the South were pushing their way north as soon as Union troops were on the horizon. Northern farmers and workers quickly discovered the evils of slavery as they encountered those very slaves who were running to their lines. And Lincoln himself, who always hated slavery and always wanted to abolish it, was empowered by these things and signs the Emancipation Proclamation. So how do we transcend the crisis of the Union? Literally, we bring an end to slavery, and people should realize that 250,000 Black troops, many of them, in fact, former slaves who'd come to the Union lines, joined the Union ranks, and it enabled Lincoln to win the Civil War as leader of the Northern forces. So, and then if we think about the 1930s, I mean, the worst economic and social catastrophe in American history, and Americans found their way to elect a president, Roosevelt, and with a New Deal, and push Roosevelt to go even further than he might even have imagined going. So when we think about American history, what we've seen is that at our best, we are radical. And actually, we're in a crisis now, not unlike the 1770s, the 1860s, the 1930s. And somehow, the powers that be, the corporate rich and their conservative and neoliberal allies have done a damn good job of leading us into a kind of amnesia. I mean, all the forces are there. They've been there for a good decade, to create a remarkable, what was in the 30s called a popular front, and literally from the bottom up transform the nation. But they've smashed labor. Sorry, I'm going on and on. Let's talk.
Well, it's interesting to hear you talk about that, because the culture war right now is raging around this, around history, really, right. around our understanding of history. Like on one side, you have kind of the liberal, or at least the new type of liberal understanding of our history, in which it's like, the 1619 thing, where it's like, racism and white supremacy is in everything, every aspect of our history. Even the American Revolution was done in order to preserve slavery in the Americas. And then you have on the other side, you have the conservative kind of view, which is like to not want to talk about racism at all, that it just doesn't, it wasn't part of any of the stuff. It seems like you have a different take on how we should see our history, and how we should embrace kind of the radical promise of America and some of the radical actions, which are the things that are erased the most out of history by both liberals and conservatives, is the sort of instances of real bottom-up radical popular movements. I mean, when you read about the sort of the creation of the labor movement in the late 19th century, it's like unbelievable radicalism that you do not learn about at all ever in public schools anywhere. What are some of those radical things that are erased that we should reclaim?
Well, I'll give you a prime example, if I can use my hero Thomas Paine. I mean, Thomas Paine's common sense, and this, by the way, is a good example of what people on the left really ought to be remembering. So Paine arrives in America when there's already a massive rebellion underway, but the American farmers and workers of the day, they think they're fighting for the rights of the British, that they should be treated equal to their British cousins. And Paine arrives and realizes that Americans have already staged essentially a revolution. They've essentially thrown out the British authorities from towns and cities. They've organized their own committees to self-regulate their lives in commerce and education and other ways. And so when he writes Common Sense, not to tell them what, he doesn't see them as in somehow failing to know what they should know. What he says is, he's basically saying, you're failing to recognize what you yourselves are doing. And he holds up in Common Sense essentially a mirror to them to show them they have it in their power to begin the world over again, because look at what they've already done. And it's noteworthy that a year before, the most important conservative intellectual of modern history, Edmund Burke, warned his colleagues in Parliament that if they pushed the Americans too far, the Americans might realize just how revolutionary they are. And this tells you something else about conservatives. Burke warned them that if Americans realize what they've done, they're going to take the next step. And it's bad enough that we might lose the American colonies, More importantly, the Americans will set an example to the world, and the entire world political and social order will be overturned. Now, not for nothing, from the time of Paine's death in 1809, actually even before his death, all the way through until essentially 1980, conservatives did everything in their power to suppress, literally suppress the memory of Thomas Paine in the American story, whether it was in the school books, in public history. And the best example I can give you of the proof of that is, if the man who writes the pamphlet that really turns the American Rebellion into a revolution, and thus is, in essence, the godfather of the United States, has no monument on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., what does that tell you? Okay. So, but then to add, if you like, irony to that tragedy, is the guy who resurrects Thomas Paine, really beyond the like Roosevelt did to some extent, and other progressive Democrats in the wake of Roosevelt. But the guy who really grabs hold of Thomas Paine is Ronald Reagan. And what he does is he grabs hold of the most radical line of Paine, which the liberal Democrats weren't even doing. And that line, again, is, we have it in our power to begin the world over again. And in that fashion, in his 1980 Republican acceptance speech at the Republican convention to be the presidential nominee for the party, in essence, he declares the Reagan Revolution by grabbing hold of Thomas Paine. Now, talk about irony. So that what happens is, over the next number of years, and now we're talking, 40 years later, it's more often the case, I'm willing to bet, that other than maybe the likes of me, that probably conservatives quote Thomas Paine more often than the left. And they do so, by the way, in anything but a radical way. They literally, in fact, sometimes invent words for Paine to defend the Second Amendment. All of it's half the time bullshit. But it is the case that the suppression of memory goes on and on and on. Another good example is probably the most, among the top leading figures in American history in the 20th century, are two figures who barely gain a notice. And one is Eugene Debs, and the other one is A. Philip Randolph, the Black believer and civil rights leader. I mean, those are two figures who should also have monuments around the country. But it's a real struggle to get these people recognized. But those are, if you like, just individuals. I tell the story in my book, Take Hold of Our History. In 2014, a conservative school board was elected in one of the counties in Colorado. And these were hardcore conservatives. And they decided that they were going to drop the advanced placement test for American history in the local public high schools, because the questions that were being posed were a little too progressive for their liking. So they did. They commanded that AP would be dropped and so on and so forth. But this tells you about what beats in the hearts and minds of Americans. The students themselves organized online, massive petition, and then chose a day, and they turned up at school dressed as American radicals from the American past, and then in mass walked out of their classes. So this struggle, by the way, back in the 1990s, in 1980s, before you guys were even born, I was working on this question of the new right.
Excuse me, I was born in 1985.
The book I'm thinking of that I worked on and the stuff was 1985. Okay. You're basically my younger daughter's age. How's that? Okay. So
I'm 86, so this is before I was born.
Yeah. No, it's back in the 80s, the conservatives went out of their way to try to literally clamp down on the teaching of U.S. history. In the 90s, I wrote a book. I hope you like the title. Why Do Ruling Classes Fear History? And yeah, and next thing I know, this has been going on for 40 years. And this latest thing about, the 1619, that kind of stuff, which, by the way, I do not subscribe to the arguments of 1619. There's no such thing as an American DNA that slavery is built into. I would rather we pay far more attention to the struggles of African Americans in every fashion to liberate themselves and their fellow Americans along the way than to just harp only in a one-dimensional way on the question of slavery and racism. And I mean that and I get a lot of criticism, but that's pretty much my view.
Check out my segment from 2 weeks ago on this very program.
Yeah, I caught a piece of it. I mean, you guys are friends with Touré Reed, who's a young friend of mine. He does a great job of doing these kinds of. Adolf Reed is another friend, and we talk about this stuff. No, it's the case that I think for the left, this is the most important point. I think for the left in particular, it's our task to start building a narrative that really highlights that the making of freedom, equality, and democracy is not going to depend on making people feel guilty. It's going to be reminding working people that freedom, equality, and democracy is pursued and won in struggle. Okay, that's the fun. I mean, that is the fundamental. And if they feel these kinds of impulses towards doing so, it's because it has been passed from one generation to the next in diverse ways. And that, in fact, there is something of a democratic imperative in American life that conservatives and the corporate rich do everything they can to suppress or to distract us from. And the more effective we are in enabling Americans to understand why they feel as they do, that they actually do carry, if you like, a sort of deep cultural memory of this kind of what it means to be an American, whether they're newly arrived or native born, as I said, whether they're black, white, brown, whatever language they spoke as a child, there is something fundamental about this. And, I'm going to use a word which people don't like to hear, especially on the left, but it actually is a rather exceptional feature of American life, this American promise. Look, every nation has its radicalism and its struggles from below, and class war goes on globally. But it is the case that ideas do matter. And it also matters that from one generation to the next, we somehow imbue Americans with an understanding as to why it is that the way things are is not the way they have to be, and why they fundamentally know that.
Yeah, I mean, I like that mostly because it actually empowers people, right? I think a lot of the narrative that we see in our media is one that's specifically meant to disempower people and feel like, well, this is the system, it is how it is, and you can't change it. But if you look at our history, things have changed as a result of the radicalism you're talking about. I wanted to read these quotes from Michael Harrington. He's the founder of DSA. And it's from fragments of the century. And he's specifically referring to the United States. He says, "It was as a socialist and because I was a socialist that I fell in love with America. In saying that I am not indulging in romantic nostalgia about youthful days on the road, but rather underlying a crucial political truth. If the left wants to change this country because it hates it, then the people will never listen to the left and the people will be right. To be a socialist is to sense the seed beneath the snow, to see beneath the veneer of corruption and meanness and the commercialization of human relationships, men and women capable of controlling their own destinies." And yeah, I mean, that's such an empowering message.
Yeah, it's one of the, I've got a whole bunch of quotes on my wall. When I read that, I did not read that. I read it years and years ago, but I was reminded of it sometime in the past couple of years. Yeah, and I mean, Michael was phenomenal figure himself, and as the founder of DSOC and DSA, and his death was a loss for the left. But he's so right. That's so much to the point. I mean, if we're going to be socialists, it means that we believe in democracy, and if we believe that the struggle is about enhancing freedom, equality, and democracy, then we can't believe for a moment that we know what other people don't. We rather have to believe that our task is to, I'm not going to use the word awaken. I won't do that. Okay. We need to encourage people to understand why they feel as they do. And, actually, there's a quote from Marx, and I won't remember it properly right now. But in 1843, and too often people think Marx begins in 1844, but in 1843, he made the observation that really the struggle is about realizing the dreams of the past. And I'm not telling us we should limit our imaginations to the past, but I do think what Marx was realizing is that there is this sort of this something about being human, where in every generation, whether you're American or not, and around the world, there are these aspirations. One of the things that empowers us as Americans in particular is this this promise about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I'll bring in another radical figure, Frederick Douglass. I don't know if you've ever read What to the Slave is the 4th of July. It's a really remarkable sermon he gave on, I think it was July 5th of 1852 to a predominantly white audience of abolitionists. And most people read that and never really finish the speech or sermon. And he's lambasting America for its failure to live up to its own ideals. And he's berating the United States. And I used to have my students read, and I'd say, tell me, is Douglass a patriot or an antagonist of the United States? And I always knew the answer was simple. If they stopped reading midway through and said he was an antagonist, they failed. Okay. If they made it to the end, the answer was waiting for them in the last couple of pages, where Douglass basically says, for everything I have said, there is this promise that we can realize. And what's interesting with Douglass is you think, well, how can he possibly embrace something written by the slaveholders, such as Jefferson in particular? But Douglass came to realize, as I think I said early on, that the promise transcended the pen. Okay, that was the fundamental agreement at the beginning. And if we're gonna only rely on the author, then we're in trouble. And it's the promise that we carry, not the author that we carry with us.
Mm. So you have to separate the art from the artist.
Good way of putting it.
Say. No, that's interesting. I guess one thing I would want to ask you, and maybe this could be helpful for the viewers at home, outside of your work, obviously, like if there was one figure that they should learn about, or one book to read, or one episode in American history that they should kind of learn about to really understand what you're talking about, like what would that be? Is it Debs, or is it something else, or what kind of story about America that you think captures that radical spirit?
That's a really great question. And okay, so since you canceled my ability to refer to my own books on this instance.
No, that's obvious. No, that's a given. That's a given.
I'll tell you something. I'm going to start with a Jacobin item. Okay. Or actually, it was the Gravel Institute, the kids at Gravel who got Matt Karp to do, about the real story of the Civil War. If anybody wants to start without reading, watch the short video that Matt did on the Civil War, explaining that the Civil War was a major left revolution, that slaves and others really carried out a revolution. Start there. Maybe that'll lead you to a whole set of related kinds of ideas and books. But if I would really say Thomas Paine is the guy you start with. Along the way, you've got, don't leave out presidents, by the way. Abraham Lincoln and FDR need to be included. Who's really good? Deb, I like speeches. I would tell people to go get some speeches by Debs. Debs had three heroes: Thomas Paine, Patrick Henry, and Jesus. Those were his three heroes. and if you read Debs, everyone thinks that Debs gave up America when he became a socialist after he was released from prison after the great strikes in 1894, the Pullman strikes and all that. But Debs fundamentally embraced Paine all the more after that. So I see this kind of tradition that goes from Thomas Paine to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the great feminist leader, to Abraham Lincoln, to Frederick Douglass, to Eugene Debs, to who's some other good, and then we can come up to Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, A. Philip Randolph. There's this great lineage, you might say, that they belong to us. And I would urge people to read their speeches. I love speeches. I think that we're underestimating them. We haven't had speech makers like that in decades. People talked about Barack Obama as a speaker. Nobody even remembers.
It was a great delivery.
What's that?
The delivery was great.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You actually read some of this stuff. It's just banal crap. There was just nothing there. It was all just
exactly.
crap.
There was, in fact, in some cases, he actually told he told people, "Yes, we can" at these rallies, and then he turned around and blamed all Americans, not the corporate rich, for the entire crisis of 2007, 8, and 9, and 10, and all of that. No, I mean, talk about abysmal. So. No, and by the way, if Bernie could really give a great speech, maybe we'd have been better off, period. But, what am I going to say? So I like speeches. It's funny. I used to require readings when I just retired this past year. I didn't want to teach online, so I retired. But there are so many good books. Eric Foner, by the way, who you had on, this dear friend. Eric Foner's stuff around the Civil War is just phenomenal. James Oakes, I believe, it has a really great book. If people like biography a bit, it's called The Radical and the Republican, and it's about the relationship between Douglass and Lincoln, and the dynamic, if you'll excuse the Marxist way of putting it, the dialectic that really existed between these two men. And I think that's one of the.
You will never have to excuse the Marxist use of anything on this program.
No, I realize.
Totally.
I do realize. And by the way, if I can just mention, and maybe in the fall you guys have me back on. So my very first book was The British Marxist Historians, E.P. Thompson, Eric Hobsbawm, and all that. And it's never really been out of print, but it's coming out anew this fall with 0 books. So, we could have a good time with that too. You'll excuse my pushing
For
that.
sure. Yeah.
Not at all.
No, thank you for doing that. We'd love to have you on. You're obviously right. And what I'm
going to quote you, and on my next book,
yes.
That's going to be on the
That should be
blurb.
your bio.
It's fair. You're obviously right.
Totally. No, but as you're talking, I mean, I'm thinking about how do we get this message out there, right? I mean, not just among people who already agree with us. I feel like right now, socialists in America are pretty insular. And also, unfortunately, there's a lot of infighting as well. I'm trying to think about how under the structures, the media structures that we're operating in, how do we get this message out there to a broader audience, right? Because right now we're doing this show on YouTube, for instance, and we fall prey to YouTube's algorithms. And I'll let you know that this video is not going to do that great, like in terms of views, right? Which is really unfortunate because they have algorithms that intentionally suppress this kind of content.
Sure.
Right. So how do we think outside the box to get the message out there?
Okay. Well, over a year ago, one time I was talking to Nomi Key about this, and I said, there's this really amazing sort of flourishing right now by way of originally podcasts and now YouTube of progressive left, what's called left shows. But among the things that are missing in these left shows, and by the way, this is not true for Jacobin stuff as much as in anyway, but it's true for all too many things, is that we really have to figure out a way, without being pedantic about it, of bringing in the kind of radical story. Okay. To bring it in. So it's not like, I'm not so sure let me talk as if I was a producer for a moment. I'm not so sure that I'd say, let's have a 5-minute segment, each week on, say, weekends. Oh, it's not the worst idea of, say, was it Paul from Wednesday nights? He does a good job I think, introducing labor figures, I believe. We could, so if it's a segment or just generally a conversation, or you have this Verso book club, okay? By the way, which by the way is modeled after what was called the Left Book Club back in the 30s in Britain, and it's great to see that happening. So I think the idea is you put it in there. The other thing is, and you'll excuse my referring to the other half of your life, Anna, but obviously I'm friends with Cenk, and I know Ben for quite some time, and we're friends. And it would be great if even folks like it at the Young Turks did a little more around these kinds of historical questions. And so it's a matter of cultivating it. And beyond that, I mean, what other miracles could we see happening? I don't know.
I heard you guys were doing a production meeting, so I decided.
If I used the word producer, I could bring you in.
Yeah. Well, I like your idea because it doesn't involve me doing dances on TikTok. So that's what I'm trying to avoid as much as I can.
Yeah, that's.
I only get those in private on the text message. You know,
Oh.
for the world.
Oh, that's the direct message between you two. I don't get those messages.
No, you don't get those either, Anna. It's too hot for you. You can't handle it.
I mean,
Yeah,
if
it's
you
not
allow me
totally
in this-
consensual.
I don't know if I should pull out now that Cale's in for the last bit, but I do want to say.
No.
Okay, I do want to say that Michael and I were. Even now I can't do it. But Michael brought in so much of that kind of historical stuff. In fact, I was always amazed when he got really interested in having me on regularly, because I wasn't doing the kind of internationalist stuff that he wanted. But you can see on Jacobin that kind of sensibility. And by the way, I mean, the magazine is fabulous. It's doing stuff that New Left Review lost touch with years ago, which really was a shame. So the makings are there. The question is, how do you break out of that? And you'll excuse me, Cale, for saying, I mean, I've had conversation with Cale, and I know there are plans underway to really, create video of a historical sort and a contemporary sort. No, that's, it's like what is to be done. And that's one of the places to start. And basically everyone has to learn to tweet things to death. I mean, I'm sure Nando and Anna, but especially Nando, you were very good in retweeting. Every 90 minutes, I figured out a way to say, hey, I'm going to be on weekends, Yeah.
Are you watching Gary V videos? Are you getting some tips on the social media posts?
Always be self-promoting. That's great. No, I'm with you on. I mean, I studied history. I mean, I'm obsessed with history. I studied history in college. It's a tool that I use because I'm not confident in my ability to interpret the present. You know what I mean? I think that like these people that just kind of see current events and they're just like, this is what I think about this, without like first like going like, let me see like what the past tells me about this. I find to be I'm always very suspicious of them. The past gives you a blueprint, which doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be stuck in it, and it's you should use it as a tool to remake the future. I think that when you mentioned Michael, that's something that he used the past for a lot, and I think pretty self-consciously. That's why he studied all the revolutionary leaders all over the world. He was like, how the fuck did those guys do it? I want to do it here. How do these fucking guys in Africa do it? How do these guys in Latin America do it? Let's get some information and some tools from them on how we can do it here now. What I think frustrates me and a lot of other people about this sort of this new liberal understanding of history is that it's a paralyzing understanding of history. Yes, it's a understanding of history that does not give you the tools to change the present. It only gives you a sense of hopelessness and that change is impossible. And I find that to be an incredibly dangerous thing. I mean, obviously don't buy the right-wing arguments against all this stuff, but there are arguments against it.
Yeah, a whole bunch of historical quotes flew into my head as you were speaking. And one of these is this. I mean, Anna said a little while ago, this is not 1776 America. I mean, it's not. This is not 1861 United States. And we're not 1932 Depression-era America. We're in a crisis of that sort, but we have resources and we have a place to start that those people didn't have. So, for example, we've had a revolution. We've had a second revolution. We've had, in essence, a sort of set of revolutionary changes in the 1930s. We've had the 60s civil rights struggle, which some people actually called a second or third American Revolution. So now we don't have to worry specifically about Jim Crow. We have to worry about a return to that kind of stuff, but we are already beyond that, as we saw a year ago in the Black Lives Matter street protests. We're beyond where those folks were. But the first thing we should not forget is the reason we turn out as we do like that is because we know it is, I'm going to use a term I don't like using because it sort of represents something else, but it is un-American to accept the way things are. And there was a writer, a journalist out of Chicago, 1900, named Henry Demers Lloyd, and he said, if there was an old statement some people thought was Patrick Henry's, it went something like, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, or something like that. And he said, no, he said, the price of liberty or democracy is that if you want to defend the rights you've been afforded, you have to create new rights for your children. In other words, you can't assume that history has ever come to an end. You've accomplished. The fact is that whatever powers that be may prevail, they're going to come back and come after you. The struggle goes on. But it also means, as we look back, we've seen the development of these rights. Look, if the corporate rich and the right, or even neoliberals, I mean, what's his name? Joe Biden was pushing for cutting back on Medicare, cutting back on Social Security. The word entitlement's a despicable term, okay? But Americans won't accept it, and which is why right now, sorry, can I give a little pitch for what I think Biden ought to do? I mean, I have no hope in all of this, but let's suppose they get the
he's watching right now.
He should be so lucky. Not us. He should be so lucky.
It's 4th of July weekend. He wants to watch or think about happy things, not negative things like war in Afghanistan.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say is that I don't know what I was going to say. I lost my train of thought. But
with the blueprint for Biden, what's Biden supposed to do if he's watching?
Okay, well, let's suppose we look. The filibuster is fucking us up. Sorry, that's the word that's
you can cuss
right?
on this program. Okay. It's okay.
Okay, that was one of the beauties of the YouTube shows until all these things started kicking in, I guess. What was the case that you could? I want to put this properly, okay? Look, we're not going to get the PRO Act, and we're not going to get For the People unless there's some miracle occurs to bring down the filibuster. But we can get a major infrastructure plan, and if in fact we get that, then the real test of Biden is going to be the executive pen, the executive authority. And there are 3 things he has to do, and if he doesn't do it, then we're screwed in the end. And that is, he needs to sign an executive order that says any dollars expended for infrastructure that go into paying workers, those workers must be guaranteed health care. 2, they must be guaranteed at least a $15 an hour minimum wage. And 3rd, they must be guaranteed collective bargaining rights. Now, when you afford people what they want and what they've been fighting for, when they secure it, they're going to fight to hold on to it. And the question is he willing to empower working people, even whatever millions of folks get involved in this project? Will he empower them to fight as well? Or another way of looking at it is, a real political leader doesn't say, I want to fight for you, vote for me. He encourages the fight in you, okay? And which is what distinguished Bernie from the whole crowd of his, people on the stage in the Democratic debates. That's the key, right? So what I'm getting at is, it's not over yet, okay? It's not over yet. And in the next several months, to whatever extent the left has any capacity to encourage political change, that we really do need to sustain a certain element of possibility in our minds and even hope, and that affords action. And by the way, and to drive home my point, FDR in 1935 got this huge spending bill through Congress. And he knew that Americans needed a second New Deal. And he used the executive pen to create the Works Progress Administration, which included all of the famous arts projects, music projects, and so on. But all the more importantly, brought millions of workers who were unemployed onto the federal payrolls and transformed the American landscape. So we'll see what we do.